Somewhere buried inside the oldest library ever discovered, wrapped in linen and hidden in a cave above the Dead Sea, there were fragments of a story that almost nobody was supposed to read. Not because it was heretical in any simple way, not because someone sat down and decided to ban it on a particular afternoon, but because it survived in pieces, scattered across different traditions and languages, and when scholars finally started reading what was left, they found something genuinely strange. Something that changes the texture of a story you probably think you already know. The flood, the judgment, the giants. Except in this version, the giants are the ones doing the talking. That's what the Book of Giants is. A text, or more accurately a collection of fragments, where the Nephilim, the enormous offspring of heavenly beings and human women, are not just background monsters in someone else's narrative. They have names, they have dreams, they send messengers, they argue among themselves about what's happening and why. They know something terrible is coming and they can't figure out how to stop it. This isn't a story about them from the outside. It reads in places like a story told from the inside. And that detail alone should make you curious, because almost every version of the flood story you've ever encountered treats the giants as a problem to be solved. They're the corruption, the proof that things went wrong, the reason the world had to be wiped clean. They don't usually get to speak. They don't usually get to be afraid. But in the fragments that survived, they do. Now, before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Seriously, I check these and every time I'm amazed. It's someone in Auckland at 2 a.m, someone in Toronto on a lunch break, someone in Lagos right before sunrise. It tells me something about why this kind of story still pulls at people everywhere, at every hour. So let me know where you are. Here's what this journey is actually going to cover, because the Book of Giants deserves more than a surface-level summary. We're going to trace where the text came from and how it ended up in multiple completely separate traditions across centuries. We're going to look at what the Dead Sea Scroll fragments actually preserve, not what later legends assumed or embellished, but what the physical pieces of parchment say. We're going to meet the giants by name, sit inside their dreams, watch them send messengers across enormous distances searching for answers from a figure named Enoch, a human who somehow became the only one capable of interpreting what was happening to them. We're going to look at the question of blame, at why the text was eventually kept outside most canons, and at what it might mean that a document this old gives a voice to the very beings whose existence supposedly justified wiping out the world. But to understand why any of that matters, you need to understand the world the Book of Giants is set inside. Because it doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a much larger tradition built around a group of beings called the Watchers. The Watchers appear in early Jewish texts, most prominently in the Book of Enoch, as a class of heavenly beings, sometimes described as angels, who were assigned to observe humanity. At some point, according to the tradition, some of them made a decision that crossed a boundary that was never supposed to be crossed. They came down. They took human wives. They had children. And those children were not human in any ordinary sense. They were enormous. The tradition describes them as giants. The Hebrew word is Nephilim, a term that carries weight and ambiguity in equal measure, and scholars have been debating its precise meaning for centuries. What the tradition is clear about is that these beings were powerful, that they consumed resources on a scale that devastated the world around them, and that their presence became one of the central problems demanding divine intervention. That intervention in the broader tradition takes the shape of a flood, a reset, a judgment so total that it reshaped everything. Most texts treat this as settled. The Watchers sinned. The giants caused chaos. The world was cleansed. End of story. What makes the Book of Giants different is that it slows down inside the part of the story everyone else rushes past. It sits with the giants in the period before the flood arrives. It captures them in the moment when they start to understand that something is closing in on them, and they don't quite know what it is or what they can do about it. Now the text itself survives in fragments. That point cannot be emphasized enough, because one of the most common mistakes people make when discussing the Book of Giants is treating it as if it were a complete, unified book that someone simply chose not to include in the Bible. The reality is more complicated and honestly more fascinating. The oldest fragments come from the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered beginning in 1947 in the caves near Qumran. Those fragments are in Aramaic and they date to somewhere around the 2nd or 1st century before the Common Era, though the tradition they preserve is almost certainly older. Then there's a completely separate version of the text that survived through an entirely different channel, the Manichaean tradition of Central Asia, a religious movement that spread along the Silk Road and preserved its own version of the giant's story in fragments found in places like Turfan, in what is now Western China. Same story, different language, different culture, different century, which tells you something important about how deep the roots of this tradition actually go. So when we talk about what the Book of Giants says, we're always talking about a reconstruction, a piecing together of fragments from caves and ruins, translated from Aramaic and Middle Persian and other languages, interpreted by scholars who are themselves making careful judgments about what fits where. That doesn't make it less meaningful. If anything, the fragmentary nature of its survival is part of what makes it remarkable. This text was not carefully copied and passed down by communities who considered it scripture. It survived the way most ancient things survive, which is barely, accidentally, incompletely. And yet what survived is enough to see something genuinely distinctive. The core characters you need to hold in your mind as we go forward are these: the Watchers, the heavenly beings who came down and broke a cosmic rule. The giants, specifically named figures like Shemihaza and Ohia and Hahia, their enormous offspring who are increasingly aware that something catastrophic is approaching. And the human world which exists in the background of the text, already shaped and harmed by the giant's presence, already on the edge of the destruction that the flood will bring. And then there is Enoch, a human being who in this tradition has been taken up, who exists somewhere between the human and the divine, and who becomes the only channel through which the giants can possibly get any answers about what is happening to them. Why did this text fall outside the Bible? Why does almost nobody grow up learning about it the way they learn about Noah and the flood? Why did it survive in fragments in desert caves and Central Asian ruins, rather than in carefully maintained religious libraries? Those are questions with complicated answers, and we're going to get to all of them. But first you need to understand where this text actually came from, how it entered the world, and what tradition it belongs to. Because the Book of Giants didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew out of something much larger, a whole literature built around the edges of the biblical story, filling in the gaps, asking the uncomfortable questions and occasionally giving a voice to the people, or in this case the beings, who weren't supposed to have one. The world that produced the Book of Giants was not the world of the Bible as most people encounter it. It was a world in between, a world of empires colliding, of traditions under pressure, of scribes and thinkers who looked at the older texts and felt that something was missing, that the canonical stories left enormous questions hanging in the air without any real attempt to answer them. Where exactly did the Watchers come from? What happened in the centuries between creation and the flood? What were the giants actually doing while the world was falling apart around them? The period scholars call the Second Temple period, roughly 530 BCE to 70 CE, was when Jewish writers began producing literature that tried to answer exactly those questions. Not to contradict the older scriptures, but to expand them, to fill the silences, to build elaborate narratives around the edges of what the Torah left unexplained. This was not a fringe activity. It was a major intellectual and religious project, and it produced an enormous body of writing. Some of that writing eventually made it into the canon. Most of it didn't. and within that broader body of literature, there emerged a cluster of texts built specifically around a figure named Enoch, a human being mentioned only briefly in the book of Genesis, described as someone who walked with God and then was taken, meaning he never died in the ordinary sense. That brief mention became the seed of an entire tradition. Writers in the Second Temple period looked at Enoch and saw a doorway, a human who had access to divine knowledge, a figure who had seen things no one else had seen and knew things no one else knew. The texts built around him, collectively called the Enochic literature, became one of the most significant bodies of writing from this entire period. The Book of Enoch, sometimes called First Enoch, is the most famous of these texts. It describes Enoch's journeys through the heavens, his encounters with angels, his visions of judgment, and centrally for our purposes, his role in the story of the Watchers and their punishment. The Book of Giants grew out of this same soil. It belongs to the Enochic tradition. It shares characters, assumptions, and theological concerns with the broader Enochic literature. But it does something the other texts don't quite do. It follows the giants into their own experience. Now, here is where the question of how we actually know this becomes important. Because we don't possess a book of giants the way we possess, say, the Gospel of Mark. There is no single manuscript sitting in a library somewhere with a title page and numbered chapters. What we have instead are fragments, and the story of how scholars identified and assembled those fragments is itself worth understanding, because it shapes everything we can honestly claim about what the text says. The primary source is the Dead Sea Scrolls. When the first scrolls were discovered in 1947 in the caves at Qumran near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, scholars eventually found themselves working through a staggering quantity of fragmentary material. Thousands of pieces of parchment and papyrus, many of them badly damaged, many of them the size of a fingernail. Among those fragments, scholars identified portions of text that seemed to be narrating the story of the giants, not as background elements, but as central characters. These fragments are in Aramaic, the common language of Jewish communities in the centuries around the turn of the Common Era, and they date paleographically, meaning by the style of the handwriting and script, to roughly the 2nd or 1st century BCE. The tradition they're preserving, though, is almost certainly older. Scholars generally believe the core narratives go back several centuries earlier than the physical manuscripts we have, probably to somewhere in the 3rd or 4th century BCE, though pinning it down precisely is the kind of thing that keeps academic careers occupied and arguments alive. The Aramaic fragments are incomplete by any measure. Some preserve extended narrative passages. Others are just a few words, the edge of a sentence, the tail end of a name. Fitting them together required patience, expertise, and a willingness to acknowledge uncertainty. Scholars like Josef Milik, who did foundational work on the Qumran texts, and later researchers like Lauren Stuckenbruck, who produced the most comprehensive scholarly study of the Book of Giants, worked to identify which fragments belonged to this particular text and what they might tell us about its structure and content. That process is ongoing. New interpretations appear. Assignments of fragments get revised. The reconstruction improves slowly over decades. But then there is the second source, which is where the story becomes genuinely strange. A completely separate version of the giant's narrative survived through a completely different transmission chain. The Manichaean tradition, a religious movement founded by the prophet Mani in 3rd century CE Mesopotamia, adopted the Book of Giants as part of its own canon. Mani apparently found in the giant's story something that resonated with his own theology of cosmic conflict between light and darkness, spiritual beings and material corruption. He either used an existing version of the text or adapted it, incorporating it into Manichaean scripture and attributing a version of it to himself. Manichaean missionaries carried this religion eastward along the Silk Road, and fragments of the Manichaean version of the giant's narrative ended up being preserved in places like Turfan, in what is now the Xinjiang region of western China, where early 20th century expeditions pulled them out of the ruins of Manichaean monasteries. Those Turfan fragments are in Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, and other languages of Central Asia. They are centuries removed from the Aramaic originals. They reflect the theological concerns of a completely different religious tradition, and yet they clearly preserve elements of the same underlying story, the same names, the same basic narrative arc, the same themes of giants confronting imminent doom and struggling to understand what is happening to them. The survival of the story in two such radically different contexts, in desert caves in the Judean wilderness and in the ruins of Silk Road monasteries, halfway across Asia, tells you something important about how deeply this narrative had embedded itself into the religious imagination of the ancient world. Identifying what belongs to the Book of Giants then means triangulating between these two sources and using the Enochic literature more broadly as a framework for understanding what you're looking at. When an Aramaic fragment from Qumran mentions a name that also appears in the Manichaean version, that convergence is meaningful. When a narrative detail shows up in both traditions independently, it's more likely to reflect the original text than if it appeared only in one. This comparative method is how scholars build a reconstruction out of what would otherwise be an impossible puzzle. And reconstruction is exactly the right word. We are not reading the Book of Giants. We are reading toward it. What we have is a narrative cycle, a set of interlocking stories about the giants that circulated in various forms, probably existed in multiple recensions even in antiquity, and that we can now partially reassemble from the pieces that happen to survive. Calling it a single book is a convenience. The reality is closer to a tradition, a gravitational field of stories pulling around common characters and concerns, committed to writing at different times, copied and transmitted and occasionally adapted, until most of the copies disappeared, and we were left with the fragments. That distinction matters not because it makes the text less significant, but because it keeps us honest about what we're actually encountering. The people who wrote these fragments were not producing a sealed, authoritative document. They were participating in a living tradition, one that had already been developing for generations, and that would continue developing after them. The giant's story was something that the ancient Jewish communities around Qumran apparently took seriously enough to copy and preserve, serious enough that multiple manuscripts seem to have existed at the site. It was also something that a major world religion on the other side of the ancient world found compelling enough to incorporate into its own canon. The languages involved tell their own story. Aramaic, the primary language of the oldest fragments, was the vernacular of much of the Jewish world in this period, distinct from the Hebrew of the older scriptures and the Greek of the wider Mediterranean world. Writing the giant's story in Aramaic meant writing for communities who lived inside a specific cultural and religious moment, communities grappling with questions about cosmic history, divine justice, and the origins of evil in a world that often felt like it was going wrong in spectacular ways. The later translations into Manichaean languages took those questions into entirely different communities, with different vocabularies and concerns. What crossed the translation gaps, what persisted in both traditions, is probably closest to the heart of whatever the original text was actually about. So, when we talk about what the Book of Giants contains, hold this in the back of your mind. We are working with fragments. We are reading a reconstruction. We have extraordinary material to work with, more than enough to see something remarkable, more than enough to hear something that feels genuinely distinctive and strange. But the complete picture is not available to us, and anyone who tells you otherwise is smoothing over exactly the complications that make this text interesting. What survives is enough. It's just not everything. And what it preserves is a window into a moment when the giants themselves finally got to speak. To understand what the Book of Giants is doing, you have to go back to one of the strangest, most compressed passages in the entire Bible, Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. It's only a few lines long, but it's like a black hole in the text. Everything bends around it. It goes something like this, in paraphrase. human beings start to multiply on the earth. The sons of God see that the daughters of men are beautiful, and they take wives from among them. God says, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever. Their days will be 120 years. Then, almost as an aside, the text says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, men of renown." That's it. No explanation of who the sons of God are. No origin story for the Nephilim. No detailed description of what they did, why they mattered, or how exactly they fit into the flood narrative that follows immediately afterward. The text simply pivots. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and the flood story begins. For later readers, especially in the Second Temple period, this was not enough. Those 4 verses begged for unpacking. Who are these sons of God? Are they human rulers? Are they members of some pre-flood elite? Or are they, as a long Jewish and early Christian tradition insisted, heavenly beings, angels, who crossed a line they were never meant to cross? Here's where the term Watchers comes in. Genesis itself never uses that word. It's an interpretive development, coming mainly from the Enochic literature. Watchers in Aramaic and Hebrew means something like those who are awake, those who keep watch, in texts like 1 Enoch. They are a particular class of heavenly beings whose job is to observe the earth, to supervise, to guard. They are meant to be boundary keepers, not boundary breakers. In the Watchers tradition, Genesis 6 is no longer vague. It's the story of a rebellion. A group of these heavenly beings, often numbered as 200, decide to descend to earth, led by a figure usually called Shemhazer or Semhazer. They bind themselves by an oath on Mount Hermon, promising not to back out, and then they take human women as wives. This is not portrayed as a romantic gesture, it's a transgression. A deliberate crossing of a species boundary, a violation of a cosmic order in which heaven and earth, divine and human, are supposed to remain distinct. Out of that transgression come offspring. And here we meet the Nephilim again, but now inside a fully developed mythic framework. In this literature, the Nephilim are the giants, the hybrid children of angelic fathers and human mothers. They're not just tall people, they embody mixture. They are literally half heaven, half earth, and that hybridity is exactly what makes them dangerous. Different texts handle the terminology differently. Sometimes Nephilim and giants are treated as equivalents. Sometimes Nephilim seems to be one group, and Gibborim, the mighty men, are another. The Greek translations use the word gigantes, which is where giant comes from in English, but that Greek term also carries the sense of beings born from the earth, or earthborn, so even the words themselves are layered. Modern scholars will argue over whether Nephilim is originally a proper name, a descriptive term, or something else entirely. There's no absolute consensus. What is more widely accepted is the basic narrative pattern. In the Enochic retelling, the Watcher's descent leads to the birth of a generation of monstrous beings, and those beings become a key part of why the world spirals into violence. The giants devour everything. They consume humans, animals, the earth's produce. When the food runs out, some texts say they turn to cannibalism. They teach warfare, sorcery, the misuse of metals and cosmetics, perverse forms of knowledge. The world becomes corrupted, not just ethically, but ontologically. The very fabric of creation is polluted by this unlawful mixture of heavenly and earthly life. That is how 1 Enoch frames the moral crisis. The flood is not just God losing patience with generic human wickedness. It is a targeted response to a specific set of cosmic crimes. The Watchers have violated their appointed sphere, their offspring have filled the earth with violence, human society has been dragged into patterns of destruction that it cannot reverse on its own. In that story, Enoch is commissioned as the go-between. The Watchers, now terrified of the consequences, ask him to intercede with the Most High to plead for mercy. He goes, receives the verdict, and brings back the answer. Judgment is coming. The Watchers will be bound, their children, the giants, will be destroyed. Even here, though, the giants themselves are mostly in the background. They are described, they are condemned, they are the problem to be solved. But you almost never hear from them directly. They are the evidence in the case, not the witnesses. This is where the Book of Giants steps in and does something different. It takes that same basic framework, the Watchers as the sons of God in Genesis 6, the giants as their hybrid children, the looming flood as a response to the corruption they've unleashed, and shifts the camera. Instead of following the angels' legal battle, it moves into the interior world of the giants themselves. Before we get there, it's worth being clear about what is solid and what is debated in all of this. Most scholars would agree that Genesis 6:1-4 is an ancient compressed fragment of a larger mythic tradition. Many would also agree that the earliest Jewish interpretation reflected in texts like 1 Enoch and the Book of Giants saw the sons of God as heavenly beings, not merely human kings. The idea that these sons of God were just powerful human rulers taking wives is a later interpretive move, showing up more clearly in some rabbinic and Christian writers who were uncomfortable with the notion of angelic beings having sex. The timeline is also debated. When exactly were these stories first told? How did they develop? Was there a single original version, or multiple strands that later got braided together? Some scholars see Mesopotamian influence, stories about Apkallu, semi-divine sages who come down from heaven and teach humanity. Others point to Greek parallels to Titan myths, to broader ancient Near Eastern patterns of gods mingling with humans and producing heroic or monstrous offspring. None of this is settled, and responsible scholarship treats these connections as possibilities, not certainties. What is much less controversial is that by the time of the Second Temple period, the Watchers and Giants schema was firmly in place in many Jewish circles. The Watchers are heavenly beings who were supposed to watch, not touch. They cross the line, the giants are their illegitimate children, the living embodiment of that line crossing. Their existence intensifies the moral crisis that leads to the flood, and Enoch stands at the centre as the human who understands what is going on and who carries messages back and forth. In 1 Enoch, this crisis is described from above and from outside. You see the heavenly court convening. You watch as the angels debate. You hear God's verdict on the Watchers' petition. The giants are collateral damage in a story about divine order and angelic rebellion. The Book of Giants, by contrast, asks a different set of questions. What did it feel like to be one of those hybrid beings watching the world unravel and slowly realizing that you yourself were the reason? What happens when the monsters have dreams? When they suspect that the flood is coming, that their father's rebellion has doomed them, and they start desperately looking for a way out? That shift in perspective doesn't erase the biblical backdrop. It depends on it. The ambiguity of Genesis 6 created the space. The Watchers tradition filled that space with a dense mythic narrative about boundaries and transgression. The giants became the flashpoint where heaven's rebellion and earth's suffering met. And then, somewhere in that evolving tradition, a writer, or several writers, decided that the giants weren't just props in someone else's judgment story. They were characters. They had interior lives, fears, anxieties. They heard rumours of a coming flood. They argued with one another. They tried, in their own clumsy, violent way, to negotiate with heaven. To see how that plays out, we have to turn from the broad biblical and Enochic backdrop to the particular fragments that the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve, where the giants' own words start to flicker into focus. When people talk about the Book of Giants, they often imagine a single bound volume like a banned Bible book sitting on a shelf somewhere. That's not what we actually have. What we really have are scraps, literally. The reason we even know this text existed is because of a very specific place on the map, Qumran, on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. In the late 1940s and 1950s, in the caves above that site, Bedouin herders and archaeologists pulled out the library of a Jewish sect that lived there roughly 2,000 years ago. That collection is what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before those discoveries, the Book of Giants was a rumour. We knew it only from much later. Heavily edited Manichaean versions in Middle Persian, Sogdian and other languages, preserved in Central Asia and China. Those texts clearly drew on some older Jewish stories about the Watchers and their gigantic children. But how old were those traditions? Were they marginal? Central? Speculative fan fiction spun out from one Enoch? Qumran changed the stakes. Among the thousands of fragments recovered from caves 1 through 11, scholars found multiple Aramaic pieces of a work that clearly belonged to the Enochic universe, clearly centered on the giants, and clearly predated Christianity. Suddenly, the Book of Giants wasn't a late fringe curiosity. It was part of the literary ecosystem of a Jewish group that took Enochic literature so seriously, they copied it obsessively. This is why people say the Dead Sea Scrolls revolutionized Enoch studies. They pushed the tradition back in time, showed it was already diverse in the Second Temple period, and proved that stories focused on the Watchers and their children were not just tolerated, but actively cherished in some circles. And sitting inside that world is our text, if you can call a few dozen broken scraps a text. Because here's the hard truth. The Book of Giants, as we know it from Qumran, is a jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces are missing, and we're not even sure how big the original picture was. The fragments are tiny. Lines break off mid-sentence. Names trail into nothing. Some pieces are so small that you only get a handful of letters. Even the best preserved fragments are full of gaps, marked by scholars with brackets and dots, to show where the original writing is gone. And because this is Aramaic, written in a script that can smudge, crack and fade, even the letters we do see are not always certain. A single stroke can decide whether you're reading the name of a giant, a verb, or a completely different word. That means every line you're about to hear comes with an invisible asterisk. Reconstructions, educated guesses, places where one scholar's "this probably says X" is another scholar's "no, this could just as easily be Y." Still, patterns emerge. When you line up the fragments, you start to notice recurring anchors, names, themes, story beats that pop up again and again. Certain giant names are like beacons. Mahaway shows up repeatedly, usually as a kind of messenger or go-between. Ohar and Hahia appear as key giant figures, sometimes as brothers, sometimes as ringleaders. In some readings, the famous biblical giant Gilgamesh is there, his name adapted into Aramaic. These names function like signposts, letting us track who's speaking, who's acting, who holds authority in this strange, hybrid society. Another recurring element is dreams. Over and over the fragments mention terrifying visions, a garden being destroyed, trees being uprooted, a tablet sinking into water and disappearing, a stone structure collapsing. The giants wake up shaken, unable to ignore the sense that these dreams mean something catastrophic for them personally. The dreams are not cozy, symbolic puzzles. They are premonitions of annihilation. Alongside the dreams you get warnings and interpretations. The giants consult one another. They debate what these visions mean. They send Mahaway, this recurring emissary, out on journeys to seek help, usually from Enoch. Enoch, in turn, interprets. He explains that the visions point toward a coming judgment, a flood, a wiping out of the giants and the cleansing of the earth. So, even with all the gaps, a basic narrative contour begins to show through. It looks something like this, in cautious outline. First, there is a community of giants, the offspring of the Watchers and human women. They have power, status, and a reputation for violence. They are not minor background monsters. They talk, they plan, they argue, they have leaders. Then something shifts. The giants begin to have disturbing dreams. Not just one individual, but multiple figures. The content varies from fragment to fragment, but the emotional tone is consistent. Dread, destruction, uprooting, erasure. These are not random nightmares. They feel like messages. The giants don't know exactly what to do with this. Some react with fear, some with bravado, some with denial. But they agree on one thing: they need interpretation. They need someone who understands the heavenly side of this crisis. Enter Manichaean. Over several fragments, he appears in the role of envoy. The giants commission him to go to Enoch, who is now imagined as living at a remote, elevated place, sometimes described as with the holy ones. Manichaean travels, delivers the giants' questions and petitions, and then returns with Enoch's response. Enoch's message in these fragments is not comforting. He confirms that the dreams are true. The giants' violence has filled the earth. Their existence itself as unlawful hybrids has destabilized creation. Judgment is set, the flood is coming. Their days are numbered. At this point, some fragments suggest further negotiations. The giants ask whether there is any possibility of mercy, any path to survival for at least some of them. Other pieces show them reacting to the verdict, mourning, panicking, or doubling down in defiance. The outline is there: revelation, interpretation, desperate response. But the precise sequence, the fine-grained emotional arc, is harder to pin down. And this is where the limits of reconstruction really matter. Depending on how you order the fragments and how you restore broken phrases, you can tilt the story in very different directions. Is this primarily a text about the inevitability of judgment? A kind of cosmic horror tale where the giants realize too late that they are doomed and nothing they do matters? Or is it also a text about attempted repentance? About hybrid beings trying clumsily and unsuccessfully to seek forgiveness for a crime that predates their birth? Do the giants come off as pure villains, or as tragic figures born into a rebellion they didn't personally start? The answers you get depend sometimes on a single reconstructed verb. Did a giant blaspheme or pled? Did he mock the message or mourn it? Scholars will publish alternate readings, propose different ways to connect fragment A to fragment B, and the emotional temperature of the story shifts with each choice. So when you hear people summarize the Book of Giants, the giants repent, the giants resist, the giants accept their fate, it's important to hear the implied maybe behind those claims. The Qumran texts give us enough to sketch a plot and identify key players. They do not give us a continuous script. What they unmistakably preserve, though, is a narrative thread running through all the gaps, a thread of foreboding, interpretation, and mounting desperation. The giants are not oblivious. They sense that something is wrong. Their dreams crack the illusion of security. For the first time, perhaps, they see themselves not as invincible rulers of the earth, but as those whose very existence is under review. They reach beyond their own circle. They send a messenger to Enoch, acknowledging implicitly that their fathers, the Watchers, are no longer a reliable channel to heaven. The old hierarchy has broken. The heavenly side of their family is under judgment. If there is any wisdom to be had, it has to come from the human who walks with God. Enoch responds with interpretation. He translates symbolic, disturbing images into a moral diagnosis and a timetable. The giants' power, their violence, their devouring of creation, these have set a clock ticking. The dreams are the sirens, the flood is the impact, and the giants, standing inside that countdown, begin to scramble. Some fragments show assembly scenes, giants gathering, discussing what to do. Others hint at prayers, written petitions, or at least attempts to send messages back up the chain. They are trying, in their own limited way, to rewrite a verdict that has already been given. That is the pulse you feel beating underneath the broken lines from Qumran. A doomed generation of hybrid beings suddenly aware that their world is about to end, clawing for explanations and for any possible escape route. In the next step, we'll zoom in even closer. We'll look at those named giants, Mahaway, Ohia, Hahia, and others, not just as symbols, but as characters. We'll trace their dreams, their arguments, and their last-ditch efforts to bargain with a heaven that has already decided their fate. If you grew up with the Flood story, you probably learnt about the Nephilim, the way a side character is introduced in a movie, briefly, mysteriously, and then the plot moves on. A sentence or two in Genesis, a line about mighty men of old, and that's it. The Book of Giants refuses to leave them as background extras. In these fragments, the giants don't appear as a faceless horde. They have names, and in ancient apocalyptic literature, that's a big deal. Think about who usually gets named in texts like this. Kings, prophets, angels, occasionally a particularly notorious villain. Names are expensive real estate. To put a name in writing is to say, this figure matters, this memory should stick, this is someone whose role in the cosmic drama is worth preserving. So when the Qumran fragments keep bringing up figures like Ohia, Hahia, and Mahaway, they're doing more than filling in a cast list. They're shifting the camera. They're letting the condemned speak. Take Mahaway in the fragments. He's not the biggest or loudest giant. He's the one who moves, the one who's sent. Over and over he appears as the envoy, the messenger shuttling between the giants' council and Enoch's remote dwelling. That role already tells you something about the world he inhabits. The giants aren't just rampaging individually, they're organized enough to convene, choose a representative, formulate questions, and commission a diplomatic mission. Mahaway isn't a random thug. He's trusted, articulate, close enough to the leadership to carry their fears to the one human they think might have answers. Ohia and Hahia show up in a different register. They're often reconstructed as brothers, sons of the Watcher Shemihaza in some readings, or at least as high-status giants. In several fragments, they're the ones reacting to dreams, interpreting them, or voicing the community's alarm. Depending on how you restore the gaps, they may come across as ringleaders trying to rally the others, or as spokesmen putting into words what everyone feels but no one wants to say, that the signs point to their own destruction. Either way, they're not silent. This is where the question of names becomes more than trivia. Names are about identity, but they're also about who gets to be remembered as a subject rather than an object. In Genesis, the giants are an anonymous problem. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. In 1 Enoch they get more texture, but the primary voices are still the Watchers, Enoch, and God's angels. The giants are mostly the consequences of someone else's sin. In the Book of Giants, the camera lowers. Ohia, Hahia, Mahaway, and company are not just collateral damage, they are narrators of their own doom. The text allows them interiority. They dream, they fear, they strategize, they argue about what the messages from heaven mean. And that tells us something about the imagination of the community that cherished this book. They were willing to explore judgment from the inside, not just declaring the wicked will perish, but asking, what does it feel like to realize you're on the wrong side of the story and it's too late to switch? To see that, you have to picture their world the way the fragments hint at it. It's a world of outsized appetites. Other Enochic texts describe the giants devouring all the toil of men, eating humans, then turning on animals, then finally on each other when nothing is left. The Book of Giants assumes that backdrop. The violence and consumption are not spelled out in every line, but they're the constant hum in the background. The reason the earth is groaning, the reason judgment is coming. Imagine living inside that machine. You're part of a ruling class that takes what it wants. Your strength is your social currency. Killing isn't exceptional. It's expected. The land is stripped, the boundaries between species and realms have been crossed, and the normal moral order, whatever humans once understood as limits, has collapsed. That's the giant's world. But the text isn't only interested in physical scale, how tall they are, how strong, how gluttonous. It plays with scale in a different dimension, social and ethical. Socially, these giants live at a scale most ancient readers could barely imagine. They're the children of heavenly beings, backed by superhuman power, commanding whole regions. When they assemble, it's not a village council. It's an elite congress of hybrid rulers who think the world exists to feed them. Ethically, though, the text shows them shrinking. Every dream about uprooted trees, falling buildings, flooded landscapes is a reminder that their apparent greatness is small against the measure being applied from above. Their society is large in the sense of impact. Its violence fills the earth, but stunted in wisdom. They tower over humans, but they misread the signs, delay repentance, argue with the interpretation. Their moral stature is out of sync with their physical and social reach. This mismatch is part of the horror. Creatures who can do so much and restrain themselves so little in a world that can no longer absorb the consequences. Here the Book of Giants lines up with, and also diverges from the giant traditions in 1 Enoch. In the Book of Watchers, the early part of 1 Enoch, the emphasis is on how the giants come to be and what they do to the world. The Watchers descend, take human wives, teach forbidden knowledge, the giants are born, wreak havoc, and the cry of the earth rises to heaven. The giants are there, but mostly as effects of their father's rebellion. The Book of Giants, by contrast, spotlights the aftermath from the giants' vantage point. 1 Enoch tells you why judgment is justified. The Book of Giants lets you listen as the judged slowly realize what is about to happen. There are overlaps, some names you'll recognize from later Enochic lists. Some motifs like the giants asking Enoch to intercede, or the idea that their spirits will become wandering evil spirits after death, echo across both. Scholars are fairly confident these texts share a conceptual universe and probably circulated in overlapping communities. But the emotional tone shifts. In 1 Enoch, the giants often feel like a problem God is going to solve. In the Book of Giants, they feel like people inside a disaster they only half understand. That's important for how we read them. It's tempting to treat the giants as pure monsters, symbolic of everything humans fear: uncontrolled strength, sexual transgression, cannibalistic appetite. And those layers are there. The text doesn't soften their crimes. It doesn't suggest the flood is an overreaction. Yet within that framework, these named giants are not completely oblivious. They're not comic book villains laughing as the world burns right up until the wave hits. They see the edge of the cliff, the repeated dream sequences, the frantic assembly scenes, the decision to send Manichaean to Enoch. All of that shows a community aware, at some level, that things have gone too far. They suspect that the violence has triggered a response from heaven. They know their fathers, the Watchers, are under indictment, and cannot help them. They grasp that their dreams aren't random nightmares, but messages, and that those messages are bad news. What they don't have is control. They're trapped between inheritance and agency. They didn't initiate the Watchers' descent, they didn't design their own hybrid nature, but they have fully participated in the world that nature made possible. The Book of Giants holds those two truths together. They are products of someone else's rebellion, and they are responsible for what they've done with that inheritance. That double awareness is what makes them tragic, rather than merely monstrous. Ohia and Hahia wrestling with terrifying dreams, Manichaean hauling petitions to Enoch, the giants gathering to argue about interpretations. All of that is what you do when you suspect the verdict is already written, but you have to try something anyway. And that's where this world of named giants starts to feel uncomfortably familiar. A powerful class living large off a collapsing order. A society built on exploitation, sensing that a reckoning is coming but unsure how or whether it can change in time. Characters who are both perpetrators and, in a sense, born into a system they didn't design. The Book of Giants invites you to watch them in that moment, before the water rises, when the dreams are clear and the options are not. It names them, it lets them speak, and then it shows what happens when even the most frantic attempts at course correction collide with a sentence handed down from a higher court. In the next section, we'll step fully into those dreams themselves, the surreal images, the gardens and tablets and crumbling structures, and see how the giants read them as messages of doom. When the Book of Giants finally lets you inside those dreams, they don't read like random nightmares. They behave like messages, cryptic, symbolic, and just clear enough to terrify anyone who suspects the sender is God. In the surviving fragments, the basic pattern goes like this. A giant, often Oya or Haya, has a violent cosmic dream. The images are big, the earth shaking, the sky darkening, structures collapsing, waters rising. Sometimes it's framed with specific symbols. A tablet being submerged or erased, a garden being destroyed, a tree being cut down or uprooted. He wakes up, shaken. He goes to the other giants. They hold what amounts to a crisis meeting. They tell and retell the dream, argue over its meaning, and then, when they can't agree, they send Mahaway to Enoch to get an authoritative interpretation. You can already see what kind of story this is. It's not a simple bad guys have bad dreams trope. It's an apocalyptic logic of revelation. The future is being disclosed, but not straightforwardly. It comes encoded in symbols that demand interpretation, and that interpretation becomes part of the drama. One of the most famous motifs, reconstructed from overlapping Aramaic and Manichaean versions, involves a building or tablet. In some readings, the giants see a huge tablet, inscribed with names or something like a record of their existence. Then a flood of water comes and wipes the writing away, leaving only a faint trace. In other versions, they see a great house, or sometimes two houses, struck and shattered, while a small part remains. Taken at face value, it's simple enough. Your world, your legacy, is about to be erased. But the Book of Giants doesn't just spell that out. It lets the characters wrestle with it. One line has a giant confessing that the dream concerns the destruction of all flesh. Another points to the Watchers and their offspring being rooted out, with only a remnant preserved. You can almost hear the shift in the council, from bravado to a shaken recognition that this isn't just about losing a battle or a city. It's about their line coming to an end. Another cluster of fragments seems to revolve around a tree, sometimes standing in a garden, sometimes towering above others. In Mesopotamian and biblical symbolism, trees are natural stand-ins for rulers, dynasties, and cosmic order. Think of the tree imagery in Daniel 4, a great tree feeding the earth, then commanded by heaven to be cut down. In the Book of Giants, the tree appears as something like a world tree or clan tree. It is cut or uprooted, its branches broken, its fruit scattered. The giants interpret this as a sign that their strength, their offspring, their dominion is about to be chopped down at the root. Some reconstructions suggest that only one branch or a small portion survives the felling, a hint toward the idea that human survivors, or perhaps Noah's line, will live on. Across the fragments, other motifs pop up: stars falling from heaven, the earth being shaken, wild beasts overwhelming others, waters rising over everything. These are stock images in ancient Near Eastern omen lore and apocalyptic texts. They're the visual shorthand for cosmic judgment. What makes the Book of Giants distinctive is not the imagery itself, but who is dreaming it and how they respond. When Nebuchadnezzar dreams in Daniel, he's a king at the top of the world, troubled by visions of statues and trees, desperate enough to summon magicians and wise men. When Daniel interprets his dreams, there's a clear hierarchy. God reveals, Daniel decodes, the king reacts. The Book of Giants takes that structure and transposes it into the pre-flood world. The giants are the ones at the top. They are the imperial class. Their equivalent of magicians and wise men is Enoch, the human visionary living apart from their violence. Their dreams play the same narrative role as Nebuchadnezzar's. They announce that the current order, however solid it looks, is under imminent review from heaven. The similarities are striking. Dreams as encoded messages. Symbolic visuals of trees, houses, tablets, a divinely authorized interpreter. A verdict that the powerful don't want to hear. But this text also runs on older cultural fuel. In Mesopotamia, where omen texts circulated for centuries, dreams were routinely catalogued and decoded according to fixed patterns. If you see X in a dream, it means Y will happen. A lion at your door might signal a powerful enemy. A building collapsing might frame the fall of a dynasty. Scribes compiled long lists of such correspondences. The Book of Giants seems to share that assumption, that dreams are part of a stable code, that symbolic images correlate with specific fates. When Oha or Hahaya narrate their dreams to the council, they sound less like people sharing personal nightmares and more like officials reporting omens that need expert reading. The difference is that their expert isn't a court diviner flipping through a manual. It's a human caught up into the heavenly bureaucracy, Enoch, who can check the meaning with the divine court directly. That's why the dreams do more than foreshadow events. They generate psychological conflict. You can feel three impulses colliding in the fragments. First, fear. The dreamers know, or at least suspect, that these images are bad news. The vocabulary around the dreams is full of terror and distress. The giants are afraid, they cry out, they assemble urgently. The tone is panic. Second, denial. Some fragments suggest competing interpretations. Maybe the dream doesn't mean total destruction. Maybe it's about our enemies. Maybe the part of the house that survives is us. In one strand of the Manichaean material, the giants initially hope that the judgment might be a near miss, that they can find some loophole or mitigation. Third, bargaining. This is where Mahaway gets his marching orders. When the giants can no longer pretend the dreams are neutral, they pivot to strategy. They send a messenger to Enoch, not simply to ask what the dreams mean, but to see if anything can be done. Can Enoch intercede? Can he speak to the Great Holy One on their behalf? Is there some ritual, some confession, some act that could soften the decree? Those three reactions, fear, denial, bargaining, are exactly what give the giants interiority. They don't respond like stock villains who shrug off the prospect of judgment. They respond like people backed into a corner by their own choices. The dreams, in other words, are not just plot devices. They're mirrors. The more the giants recognize themselves in the symbols, the devastated garden that looks like the world they've stripped bare, the collapsed house that echoes their own violent cityscapes, the erased tablet that feels like their genealogy being wiped, the harder it becomes to maintain the story that they're innocent victims of some arbitrary divine mood. And yet the text doesn't make their self-knowledge neat or complete. The fragments suggest confusion and argument. Some giants seem more alarmed, others more resistant. The council is split between those who want to face the implications of the dreams and those who want to spin them. That messy debate is where the Book of Giants feels close to other Enochic material. In 1 Enoch, the Watchers, after realizing their mistake, beg Enoch to write a petition to God. They hover between hope and despair, their visions of the future driving them first to ask for mercy, then to collapse when the answer is no. The Book of Giants seems to replay that cycle in the next generation. The fathers had heavenly visions. The sons have ominous dreams. Both try to enlist Enoch. Both are told that the sentence stands. At the same time, we have to be honest about how much of this is reconstruction. The Qumran fragments are badly broken. Scholars line up scraps, compare them with the later Manichaean Book of Giants, and with Enochic parallels, and propose how the dreams might have looked in their fuller form. In some cases, there's broad agreement that there was a tree dream, that there was a house or tablet dream, that flood imagery and erasure of names played a role. In other details, the exact wording, who says what, which giant dreams which image, the reconstructions diverge. Some readings give Ohia a more dominant role as dreamer and interpreter. Others elevate Haya as the one who voices the most insight or the most panic. Some versions emphasize the survival of a righteous remnant. Others keep the focus squarely on the total annihilation of the giant's line. The Manichaean tradition adds its own theological spin, weaving the dreams into a dualistic cosmology that the original Jewish text probably didn't share. So when we talk about the dream of the tablet or the dream of the tree, we're talking about a family of closely related scenarios that scholars have stitched together from overlapping sources. The core message, judgment is coming, your world is going to be wiped out, a remnant beyond you will survive, is stable. The exact cinematic details remain a little blurry. That blur actually fits the theme. The giants live in a state of partial knowledge. They see enough to know doom is on the way, but not enough to control or escape it. Their dreams are the perfect vehicle for that, terrifying, vivid, and ultimately dependent on a voice from outside their system to say what they really mean. And that sets up the next move in the story. If the dreams are warnings, Enoch is the one who turns those warnings into articulated judgment. Mahaway's journey to him is not just a plot beat, it's the hinge between ominous symbolism and explicit verdict. The giants have seen the signs in their sleep. Now they're about to hear, in words they can't ignore, what those signs demand. To get there, we have to follow Mahaway out of the giants' council, across whatever ravaged landscape separates their cities from Enoch's dwelling, and listen in as a human scribe tells superhuman beings what their dreams were really saying all along. Mahaway's mission sounds simple when the giants first propose it. Go find Enoch. Ask what the dreams mean. Come back with a solution. But in the logic of the Book of Giants, that simple errand is doing a lot of work. First, Mahaway himself, in the fragments. He's not just a random giant pulled out of the crowd. He's singled out by name repeatedly. He's described in some reconstructions as one of the mightiest, a kind of champion or trusted agent. In the Manichaean material he rides on the winds, or is carried by something like an eagle. In the Aramaic, the details are thinner, but the pattern is the same. When the giants need a messenger, they send Mahaway. That choice already tells you something about how they see this journey. They're not dispatching a low-level servant to run an errand. They're sending someone who can represent them, argue for them, maybe even negotiate. Someone who carries their collective dread and their last shot at bargaining. The fragments hint that this isn't Mahaway's first trip either. Some lines seem to recall an earlier journey. Mahaway going out, finding Enoch, returning with a written reply. In some reconstructions, the giants have already heard one warning from Enoch, possibly via a tablet or written message, and the dreams are a second wave of confirmation. That would make this visit a kind of follow-up appointment with the cosmic court. If that's right, the tension ramps up immediately. Mahaway isn't going to a stranger, he's going back to a man who has already delivered bad news. And still, the giants send him. That's the core dramatic knot of this section of the story. On one side, you have their craving for clarity. The dreams won't let them rest. They need to know with precision what they're facing. How total is the destruction? How soon is there any way out? In a world where divine messages often come coded and indirect, getting an authorized reading is priceless. On the other side, you have the cost of asking. Once Enoch speaks, they can't claim ignorance. They can't hide behind ambiguity or hopeful misreadings. The moment Mahaway comes back with a clear interpretation, evasion becomes much harder. You see that psychological ambivalence hinted in the way the texts frame the request. They want Enoch to explain, but they also want him to intercede, to find a loophole. Knowledge and petition are fused into the same journey. Mahaway's path embodies that. The fragments don't give us a travel diary, no itinerary, no map, but the tradition consistently imagines Enoch living at a remove from the giants' cities. He's not next door. He's in the wilderness or on a mountain or at some threshold between earth and heaven. So when Mahaway leaves the giants' council, the narrative is making him cross more than physical distance. He's travelling from the world they've built through violence and exploitation into the orbit of a human who has stepped out of that system and aligned himself with the heavenly court. The space between those 2 points is symbolically loaded. In a lot of ancient stories, journeys to seers or prophets are acts of humility. Powerful figures step down, leave their palaces, and go seek someone socially beneath them but spiritually above them. Think of kings consulting oracles or rulers sending envoys to desert prophets. Mahaway's trip to Enoch feels like a pre-flood version of that pattern. The giants, who are physically and militarily dominant, are forced to acknowledge that there's one thing they can't generate for themselves: a reliable word about their fate. They can build cities, breed armies, tear the earth apart, but they can't interpret the dreams without going to a frail human who walks with God. That inversion of status is part of the book's theology. Authority doesn't sit with the biggest bodies or the loudest armies. It sits with the one who can move between human and divine spheres, who can read the code of dreams because he's been admitted to the celestial archive. That's Enoch's role. In 1 Enoch, he's the scribe of righteousness, the one who writes petitions for the Watchers and receives verdicts from the Most High. In the Book of Giants, that job description gets expanded. He's not just a secretary taking dictation, he's an interpreter and mediator. The fragments suggest a 3-layered chain of authority. At the top is God, the Great Holy One, the Lord of Spirits, or similar titles we see in related Enochic texts. Below that is Enoch, the human who's been granted access to heavenly secrets. At the bottom are the Watchers and their giant offspring, who once thought of themselves as the top of the food chain, but now find themselves dependent on a human go-between. Mahaway goes to Enoch, because Enoch has 2 kinds of capital the giants lack. First, epistemic capital he knows, or at least he's allowed to know. The dreams belong to a stable symbolic code, but you still need someone plugged into the divine side of that code to tell you what particular images mean here and now. Second, relational capital, he can speak on their behalf. When Mahaway asks Enoch to interpret, he's also asking him to petition, to remind God, to advocate. In some Enochic passages, Enoch is almost like a defense attorney delivering a plea in a courtroom. The Book of Giants seems to borrow that legal imagery. The giants are under indictment, the dreams are the charges being read out in symbolic form, and Enoch is the one who can clarify the case and its sentence. But the text doesn't let that process be comfortable. The very act of sending Mahaway is double-edged for the giants. If Enoch comes back with a soft message, judgment delayed, destruction partial, room for repentance, then Mahaway has saved them. If he comes back with a hard decree, then Mahaway becomes the one who brings the full horror of their destiny into focus. This is why the journey functions as more than a plot connector. It's the narrative space in which the giants' inner conflict gets externalized. While Mahaway travels, the giants remain behind in suspended anxiety. They've stepped toward repentance, at least enough to seek divine insight, but they haven't yet accepted responsibility. They're hovering between we've gone too far and maybe we can still gain this. Symbolically, Mahaway is walking that line. In some later Manichaean expansions, his route is described in almost mythic terms. He crosses seas of water, mountains of darkness, strange winds. Those embellishments tell you how pre-modern audiences felt the weight of this trip. It wasn't a quick consult, it was an ordeal, a pilgrimage to the edge of the world where heaven and earth touch. The Qumran fragments themselves are more restrained, but they still hint that Mahaway goes to Enoch as if crossing a boundary. Enoch, by this point in the broader tradition, is not just living in a hut outside town. He's been taken up, or at least lives in close proximity to heavenly realms. A journey to him is effectively a journey toward the place where verdicts are issued. That's why distance matters. As long as the giants stay in their own fortified spaces, they can maintain the story that they're in control. Sending Mahaway out is the first acknowledgement that control has slipped. Every step he takes away from their city is also a step away from their rebellion, and toward the possibility of repentance, or at least toward a sober recognition of what rebellion has cost. At the same time, the sources don't all agree on how repentant the giants really are. Some readings of the fragments suggest genuine contrition, lines that sound like confession, admissions that we have sinned, that our violence has filled the earth, that we are not righteous. That would frame Mahaway's mission as part of a last-ditch attempt to seek mercy. Other reconstructions are bleaker. In those, the giants want to know the verdict and search for any tactical advantage, but there's little sign of moral change. They're sorry about the consequences, not the cause. The Manichaean Book of Giants, with its dualistic lens, sometimes paints them more as cosmic opponents whose fate is sealed, their appeal more technical than heartfelt. Holding those versions together, a picture emerges of giants who are torn. They're smart enough to see that the game is up. They're proud enough to hope that knowing the rules might let them bend them. They're desperate enough to send their strongest out into the unknown, to ask a man who walks with God what, if anything, can still be done. The surviving fragments leave Mahaway's actual conversations with Enoch partially obscured, but we can see the contours. He reports the dreams, he asks for an interpretation. He requests intercession. Enoch responds not with flattery or delay, but with a message that comes from the holy ones, from the heavenly tablets, from God. That's the moment the story is steering us toward. The dreams were the warning shots. Mahaway's journey is the approach to the courtroom. Enoch's coming speech is the reading of the sentence, and the Book of Giants lingers on this in-between stage just long enough for us to feel what's at stake. Once Mahaway returns, there will be no more plausible deniability, no more hiding behind conflicting interpretations. The giants will have what they said they wanted, an authoritative answer. The only question left will be what that answer allows, and what it refuses. To see that, we have to listen next, not just to Enoch's words, but to the role he's asked to play in a crisis that started long before the giants were born. When Mahaway finally reaches Enoch, the tone of the whole story shifts. Up to this point, everything has been rumour, fear, and symbolic fragments. Dreams of falling trees, crashing mountains, sinking ships. Half-understood omens that might mean anything from prepare for war to abandon everything. Enoch is where that fog condenses into sentences. In the wider Enochic tradition, that's exactly who he is. He's not just a pious ancestor who walked with God and then disappeared, the way Genesis briefly sketches him. In the literature that grew up around his name, he's a scribe, a prophet, and an intermediary all at once. He writes for heaven, he speaks for earth, he moves in between. In 1 Enoch, he's the one the fallen watchers ask to compose a petition on their behalf, to carry their plea up to the divine throne. He records visions, journeys through cosmic archives, reads books of destiny. When you see Enoch in these texts, you're looking at a human being who has been plugged into the celestial information system. The Book of Giants leans hard into that identity. It assumes that by the time you're reading these fragments, you already know Enoch's job description. You know he's the scribe of righteousness, the one who writes and reads heavenly tablets. So when Mahaway finds him, the narrative doesn't need to build up his authority from scratch. It just has to activate it, and it does that in a very specific way. Enoch doesn't just have opinions about the dreams, he has documents. Several reconstructions of the Aramaic fragments suggest that Mahaway doesn't simply get a spoken interpretation. He receives a written message, a letter, a tablet, something that can be carried back, read aloud, and crucially, cited. In other words, the giants aren't just asking Enoch, "What do you think this means?" They're asking for paperwork. That's important, because it changes the framing of the whole crisis. Judgment isn't just an emotional reaction from an angry God. It's something recorded, scheduled, and delivered. A decree with content and timing, inscribed somewhere above and then transmitted down the chain of command. Enoch stands exactly at the point where that inscription becomes intelligible on earth. The text hints at this through its language of tablets and writings. In related Enochic passages, verdicts are said to be written in heavenly books, sins recorded, destinies fixed, lives measured. The Book of Giants seems to assume the same pattern. Mahaway comes to the man who can open those files, read the relevant entry, and translate it into human speech. That's what it means in this world to read the signs. The giants have already been given signs in their sleep, in their shared nightmares of rooted things being uprooted. But dreams are part of a symbolic economy. You need someone authorized to crack the code. Enoch doesn't make the meaning up. He looks it up. That's the narrative's claim anyway. So what does he find? The fragments are broken, but the gist is bleak. Enoch's message confirms what the dreams have been whispering. The violence of the giants has filled the earth, the corruption of the Watchers has reached its limit, and a flood of destruction is coming. Their towers, their cities, their bodies themselves are marked for erasure. In some lines, the language is legal. The giants are condemned. Their fathers, the Watchers, are bound and imprisoned. There are references to chains, pits, abysses. It reads like a sentencing document from a cosmic court. In others, the language is more like weather, waters rising, foundations shaken, mountains dislodged. But even those images arrive not as vague poetry, but as part of a written announcement. This will happen to you for these reasons. That's the heart of Enoch's role in the crisis. He doesn't cause the judgment. He doesn't invent the punishment. He reveals that a decision has already been made somewhere higher up, and that the giants' dreams were the notification system starting to blink red. This is where the question of mercy comes in, and the text is deliberately ambiguous. On one reading, Enoch's message to the giants is nothing but confirmation of doom. Their petition has come too late. Their crimes, bloodshed, exploitation, perversion of created order have already tipped the scales. The writing is literally on the tablet. All Enoch can do is read it. That interpretation lines up with earlier episodes in the Enochic corpus. When the Watchers first ask Enoch to intercede, he carries their plea up, waits for an answer, and comes back with a heartbreakingly simple reply: no. Their sentence stands. Their request is refused. If the Book of Giants is echoing that scene, then Mahaway's mission is tragically similar. A desperate appeal answered with an unalterable verdict. But some interpreters see hints of something more complicated. In a few reconstructed lines, the giants are told to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to abandon their violence, to seek something like righteousness. That kind of language sounds less like a cold reading of a fixed decree, and more like a warning. There is still a way to respond, even if the broad outline of the flood is not going to change. It's not mercy in the sense of the disaster will be cancelled. It's more like the form of your end, and what comes after it can still be shaped by whether you acknowledge what you've done. The fragments don't spell out what that would look like. There's no clear if you repent, then you will be spared clause. The closest we get is the pattern embedded in the narrative itself, the very act of seeking Enoch, of asking for interpretation, of hearing a written decree, is a chance to move from defiance to confession. The giant's response to Enoch's words, whatever exactly those words were, is where mercy or its absence would be revealed. Do they double down in rage? Do they crumble in grief? Do they try to save themselves or anyone else? Our copies don't let us watch that in detail. But the stress the text places on Enoch's letter suggests that, at minimum, they are given understanding. They won't die in ignorance, still telling themselves they were the heroes of their own story. That's already a kind of severe grace. It also crystallizes the contrast between Enoch and the Watchers. The Watchers began as heaven's envoys. In 1 Enoch, they're holy ones sent down to watch, to teach, to maintain the link between God and humanity. Their authority was supposed to be derivative. They carried messages. They did not author them. By the time of the giant's crisis, that authority is gone. They've used their knowledge to exploit, not to lift up. They've used their power to take, not to guard. They are themselves under indictment, their own petitions rejected. In some of the earliest Enochic scenes, it's already Enoch, a human who has to explain to them what their fate will be, because they no longer have access to the counsel they once served. The Book of Giants takes that inversion and pushes it further. The fallen angels, former messengers, are now cut off from the message. Their hybrid offspring who dominate the earth physically are cut off from understanding their own future. Standing between them and the divine verdict is a man of dust who never left his appointed station. Enoch's authority is borrowed but real. He doesn't command the flood, he announces it. He doesn't negotiate the terms, he communicates them. He's like a court clerk reading out a sentence he did not write, yet his voice is the only one the defendants get to hear. For the giants. That's the sharpest edge of this whole episode. They learn about their end not through an angelic proclamation blazed across the sky, but through the quiet words of a human scribe reading from a heavenly record. Their last glimpse of divine intention comes through the very kind of being they once despised and devoured. What they learn is not just that they will be destroyed, but that their destruction has meaning. It is not random. It is not an unlucky accident of history. It is, in the logic of the story, a response to specific patterns of violence and corruption that have been observed, measured, and inscribed. The dreams hinted at it. Enoch confirms it. After he speaks, there's no more refuge in confusion. The giants know that the world they've built is under a written sentence. They know that their size, their strength, their lineage from heavenly beings do not exempt them from judgment. And they know that the last word on their fate did not come from their fathers, the Watchers, but from a heaven that has already stripped those fathers of their authority and handed interpretive power to a faithful human. That's Enoch's role in their crisis. He's the one who turns dread into knowledge, rumour into decree, dreams into a readable script. He doesn't save the giants from the flood, at least not in any way our fragments preserve. But he does something the text treats as just as important. He makes sure they understand why the water is coming. If Enoch's letter explains what is going to happen, the next question is why. And that takes us back to the Watchers. In the Enochic universe, they're not just a random group of bad angels who happen to misbehave. They are the pivot point where the story claims the world went wrong. Not because they existed, but because they crossed lines they were never meant to cross. Their job originally was all about boundaries. They were watchers precisely because they were supposed to watch, to stand on the border between heaven and earth, observe, report, maybe instruct in limited ways, but always as representatives of a higher will. They were a conduit, not a new source. The fallen Watchers, as the tradition tells it, decided that wasn't enough. In 1 Enoch's book of the Watchers, the rebellion begins with a decision to descend to the daughters of men. That sounds romantic on the surface, but the text treats it as a violation of categories. Heavenly beings taking human women, crossing the line between divine and mortal spirit and flesh. In the same cluster of stories, they don't just take partners, they also take authority. They start teaching on their own terms, metals and weaponry, cosmetics and seduction techniques, sorcery, astrology, root-cutting, occult arts. Things that in themselves might seem neutral or even useful, but here are framed as knowledge given without permission, in ways that accelerate violence and exploitation. In that sense, the Watchers are portrayed as the initiators of boundary breaking on two fronts at once. They transgress the boundary of their own nature, and they empower humans to transgress the boundaries of theirs. The giants are what happens next. In Genesis 6, the whole episode gets boiled down to a few terse lines. The sons of God see the daughters of men, take them as wives, and their offspring are the Nephilim, the mighty men that were of old, men of renown. Then the story jumps almost immediately to God's sorrow over human wickedness and the decision to send the flood. The Nephilim appear more as a symptom in the background than as main characters. 1 Enoch and the Book of Giants zoom in on that gap. They spell out the connection between the Watchers' choices and the existence of these enormous hybrid beings. The giants are not a separate fall. They are fallout. They are literally the children of transgression, walking embodiments of a boundary that has been erased. And that's where the moral tangle starts. On one level, the giants are clearly perpetrators. The fragments talk about their violence in sweeping terms. They devoured all the labour of men. They drank the blood of creatures when food ran short. They turned on humanity itself. Their dreams of uprooted trees and collapsing mountains are explicitly tied to their own destructive behaviour. The earth in these stories is groaning under the weight of what they've done. But step back a bit, and they also look like victims. Nobody asked them if they wanted to be born as 300-cubit monsters with appetites that break the ecosystem. They didn't design the genetic experiment that made them too powerful, too hungry, too unrestrained. That was their father's doing. The Watchers took their own desire and their own secret knowledge and wrote it into bodies that were never meant to exist. So when the judgment comes, who bears the blame? Different texts tilt the answer in different directions. Genesis, as preserved in the Masoretic text, is remarkably understated. It doesn't dwell on angels at all. It simply says that human wickedness became great, that every inclination of the human heart was bent toward evil, and that God regretted making humankind. The sons of God and Nephilim appear almost as a footnote. Something weird happened. Giants were around, but the primary emphasis is on human culpability. 1 Enoch flips the camera. There, the fallen Watchers are front and centre. They swear an oath together on Mount Hermon, deliberately plotting their descent. Their teaching corrupts human society. Their offspring ravage the earth. When the flood is decreed, the divine complaint is aimed first at them. They are bound, chained, cast into pits of darkness to await the final judgment. The giants are condemned too, but their spirits become wandering demons after their bodies die, harassing humanity until the end of days. In that telling, the Watchers are the original offenders. The giants are collateral damage that become co-offenders. The Book of Giants stands uncomfortably in the middle. On the one hand, it never lets the Watchers off the hook. The language of your fathers in some fragments is loaded with accusation. The giants know their lineage is the problem. The punishment of the angels, binding, imprisonment, loss of access to heaven, frames everything. The whole crisis exists because these celestial beings broke the rules. On the other hand, the narrative spends most of its space with the giants themselves. We see their dreams, their fear, their arguments. We follow their messengers, not the angels. We hear their attempt at petition, their desire to know if there is any way out. By centering their perspective, the text forces you to confront them not only as monsters, but as agents. They are both product and participant. They inherit a catastrophic situation, and then they amplify it. They are shaped by someone else's rebellion, and then they choose their own. That dual status is part of a broader pattern you see in apocalyptic literature. These texts tend to distribute blame across multiple levels of reality. Human beings are responsible for their actions, but there are also cosmic powers, spiritual forces, archons, watchers, princes of nations, the language varies, that influence, magnify, or distort human choices. Evil is not imagined as a simple, straight line from a single bad decision. It's more like a feedback loop between visible and invisible actors. Why tell the story that way? One reason is explanatory. When communities looked at the scale of suffering and injustice in their world, empires crushing nations, violence baked into institutions, corruption that seemed bigger than any one person, it felt inadequate to say some individuals made poor choices. Apocalyptic texts respond by saying, "You're right. There are larger powers at work. There are systems of deception and violence that predate you and outsize you." Another reason is moral. If everything is blamed on cosmic forces, human responsibility disappears. But if everything is blamed on humans, the depth of the problem gets flattened. The Enochic traditions try to avoid both extremes. The Watchers introduce the infection. Humans and giants spread it. Judgment addresses the whole network. That framework is exactly what makes the giants' situation so tragic. Because once you see the story this way, their anticipation of doom isn't just bad guys finally getting what's coming to them. It's more complicated and more unsettling. You're watching beings who never asked to be born into a broken order, who have nonetheless done terrible things, realizing that the bill for an entire era's corruption is about to be collected, and that their bodies are the most visible symbol of the debt. They are children of a crime that they also commit. When they send Mahaway to Enoch, when they lie awake at night shaking from dreams of their own annihilation, you're hearing that tension. They know they filled the earth with blood. They also know, or at least suspect, that they're enacting a script their fathers handed them. They're trying to find out if the author of that script will distinguish between origin and execution. The answer they get is devastating precisely because it doesn't fully disentangle those threads. The Watchers will be punished. The giants will be destroyed. Humanity will be cut back to a single family. The flood in these texts is not a targeted strike on one offender, but a reset of an interconnected system. And the giants, standing there with Enoch's written decree in their hands, are left to face a truth that apocalyptic literature keeps bringing to the surface. Sometimes you are judged not only for the evil you chose, but also as the embodiment of a world that has been twisted long before you, and through you, and beyond you. That is the weight sitting behind their dreams, their petitions, their fear of the water on the horizon. In that light, the way the Book of Giants talks about violence isn't casual at all. It's not a crime report, it's ecology. When the fragments describe the giants devouring everything, it's not just poetic exaggeration. The picture is of a world that literally can't sustain them. They consume the toil of men, which is agricultural labour. They strip the land, they slaughter animals faster than they can reproduce. And when that isn't enough, they cross the last boundary and start eating human beings. That escalation matters. In most ancient law collections you have categories: theft, assault, murder, individual wrongs, individual penalties, but the Enochic material ramps straight past that into something else. The giant's violence is presented as system level. It breaks the food chain, destabilizes the earth, and pulls everything into a spiral of scarcity and fear. It's the difference between a single arsonist and a wildfire that changes the climate pattern of a whole region. The language in 1 Enoch and in related fragments leans into this. The earth cries out because of them. The animals accuse them. Even the plants, in some retellings, are described as withering under the curse brought by their bloodshed. It's a portrait of violence as world-destroying in a very specific sense. Not that the giants have the power to personally unmake creation, but that their way of existing makes the world unable to function as it was meant to. And in apocalyptic logic, that kind of breakdown doesn't stay contained. Corruption spreads. That's one of the basic assumptions humming underneath these texts. Sin, injustice, whatever word you want to use, is not just a set of isolated bad deeds. It's more like a contaminant in a closed system. Once introduced, it diffuses. It seeps into relationships, institutions, land, animals, even time. You see that assumption already in Genesis 6, which is much more minimal but still very clear. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. Not just humans. All flesh. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, similar language gets applied to the land itself. Bloodshed pollutes it. Idolatry defiles it. Those aren't metaphors for feelings, they're metaphors for accumulated consequence. The Book of Giants is operating in that same conceptual universe, but tuned to a higher pitch. The Watchers introduce forbidden knowledge and cross the species boundary. The giants embody that crossing and act it out in extreme form. Their violence becomes a kind of carrier wave. As they exploit, humans imitate. As they tyrannize, human rulers learn. The fragments are spotty, but the through line is clear enough. The world is no longer just a place where some people do bad things. It's a place where the normal is bent. From that vantage point, the ethics of judgment look different. Instead of a god angrily flipping the table because of a few infractions, the flood and the destruction of the giants are framed as something like a drastic medical procedure. A cleansing, but of a dangerous sort. You don't amputate because you hate the limb. You amputate because the infection has reached a point where leaving it alone means losing the whole body. That's how the Enochic tradition talks about it. The earth is filled with blood. The giants are multiplying. Their spirits, even after death, will continue to harass humanity. The disease won't burn out on its own, left unchecked. It will keep generating new forms of violence and distortion. So the story presents a hard conclusion. The system has to be interrupted from the outside. What's important, though, is that the texts don't say, the giants are uniquely bad, everyone else is fine. By the time judgment is announced, the contagion is everywhere. Humans are participating in it, enjoying the weapons, the beauty tricks, the occult shortcuts. The giants are simply the most visible crystallization of that whole distorted arrangement. They are the symptom you can't ignore. That logic of contamination and cleansing fits within a wider world of flood traditions, and it's worth connecting those dots, even if we can't map every line of dependence with certainty. From Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, you get stories of a primeval deluge that wipes out almost everything, and then a tiny remnant that survives. In Atrahasis, the problem is overpopulation and noise disturbing the gods. In the Gilgamesh epic, the reasons for the flood are muddled and contradictory. In Genesis and Enoch, the emphasis is moral corruption and violence. What ties them together is the pattern. Something about human or quasi-human existence has become intolerable. The gods or God decide on a reset. One family or chosen hero preserves continuity. The world starts again. The Book of Giants takes that pattern and gives it a very specific twist. The giants in this telling are not just background freaks wandering around before the rain starts. They are part of the reason the reset is necessary. Their existence concentrates all the anxieties that flood myths channel: excess, hubris, appetite without limit, power without responsibility. And because this text keeps their viewpoint in focus, you also see what it feels like from inside that role. They're not quietly waiting to be erased. They're trying to make sense of it. Their dreams are filled with images of trees uprooted, tablets submerged, the earth cracking open. They don't just see random chaos. They see themselves in the middle of it. In some fragments, a giant figure is cut down, while others look on in terror. In others, structures they rely on, mountains, cities, thrones, are swept away. Those images aren't just about personal death. They're about the end of an order. To the giants, that's the horrifying part. They gradually realize that they are not only going to die, they are part of what is killing the age they live in. Their bodies, their size, their violence, their very presence have helped push the world to a point where continuation without change is impossible. That's what makes the flood in this imagination more than punitive. It's a cosmic reset. Destruction here is framed as consequence. Not in the simplistic sense of do X get Y, but in the deeper sense that some ways of organizing power and desire eventually collapse under their own weight. The judgment announces that collapse and accelerates it into a single generation. And because the narrative is so invested in cosmic order, boundaries between heaven and earth, between kinds, between permitted and forbidden knowledge, the reset has another layer. It's not only about stopping violence, it's about redrawing lines that have been smeared. The Watchers are confined. Access between realms is restricted. The giants' bodies are removed from the world, even though their disembodied spirits linger as a reminder of what went wrong. Human life is pared back to a small, fragile seed in Noah's family. The post-flood world, in this view, is deliberately less spectacular, less hybrid, less explosive than the one that came before. From the giant's side, that feels like annihilation. When they read or hear Enoch's verdict, they're being told that the only way for the world to continue is for their world to end. Their cities, their feasts, their hierarchies, their very category of being has become non-viable. In apocalyptic logic, they are not just in the path of judgment, they are one of its targets and one of its causes. That's why their fear in the fragments is so intense. It's not just dread of pain or even of death. It's the dawning awareness that they are inseparable from a corrupted order that cannot be patched up. If the world is going to be cleansed, as the angelic messages imply, then beings like them cannot be part of what comes next. So when the waters rise in this tradition, they're carrying more than rain. They're carrying the conviction that some stories, however tragic, have to end so that any story at all can go on. And the giants, for all their strength, are forced to watch themselves become the explanation for why that end arrives. If we try to line up the fragments and read them as a single storyline, we have to be honest first. We're reconstructing. Pages are missing. Sentences break off mid-thought. You never get the neat, cinematic last stand of the giants scene. But what we do get is a consistent drift in one direction. The early pieces pulse with anxiety and confusion, dreams, omens, trips to Enoch. By the time you get to the later fragments, the language has shifted. It's no longer, what does this mean? It's, what has been decreed about us? That word decree is doing a lot of work. You see variations of it in the Aramaic fragments and in related Enochic texts. What has gone forth? What has been written on the tablets of heaven? What has been decided by the Holy One? The grammar leans heavy on the perfect tense, as if the verdict already belongs to the past even while the giants are still breathing. From their perspective, the doom is in motion before a drop of water falls. So, if we sketch the likely narrative arc, it looks something like this. The giants sense disaster through dreams. They send messengers to Enoch. Enoch returns or sends word back with a divine legal ruling. That ruling announces not just suffering but the end of their entire class. And the rest of the story is them living under that sentence as the world tips into catastrophe. In other words, it's less a surprise twist and more a slow-motion execution. The fragments that preserve portions of Enoch's message hit three notes over and over: inevitability, completeness, and separation. Inevitability comes through in formulaic phrases: "It is fixed. You will have no peace. The judgment has been written. These aren't negotiations. Nobody is bargaining over terms. The giants ask for knowledge, not for mercy. And what they get back is knowledge of a future that cannot be redirected." Completeness shows up in lines about their end, their extinction, the destruction of your offspring and of your beloved ones. The verdict is not just, "Some of you will die in a war," or "A few leaders will be punished." It's a class sentence. The hybrid line itself is set to be erased. And separation is the strange part. The judgment doesn't only target bodies, it targets status. Enoch's message, as preserved in related Enochic material, makes it clear the Watchers will be bound and imprisoned, shut up in the prisons until the final judgment. They lose access to heaven, lose their place among the holy ones, and are confined to the underworld or to a remote, uninhabited part of creation. The giants, by contrast, are destined for a more immediate physical end. They are to be slain, destroyed, consumed. The flood is one instrument, but not the only one. Some traditions have them killing each other in internecine war before the waters ever arrive. Others hint at famine, at the earth turning against them, so that their insatiable hunger collapses back on them. So what is the text emphasizing? Annihilation, imprisonment. Legacy? It depends on which layer you're looking at. On the bodily level, the emphasis is annihilation. The fragments point toward the wiping out of their fleshly line. No more hybrid warriors striding over mountains, no more demigod kings terrorizing villages. That's the meaning of their end, not just an individual death, but the termination of a way of being in the world. On the cosmic legal level, the focus is imprisonment and containment. The Watchers, the original transgressors, are locked away. Their sphere of action is curtailed. Access between their realm and the human realm is narrowed down to almost nothing. But then there's a third dimension. What continues after their physical presence is gone. In later Enochic interpretation, you get the idea that the disembodied spirits of the giants become malevolent beings, unclean spirits, wandering on the earth, harassing humans until the final judgment. That's not fully spelled out in the surviving Book of Giants fragments, but it's tightly connected in the wider tradition. When a fragment mentions that their spirits will continue, or that demons originate from that generation, it's gesturing toward that legacy. So it's not a simple either-or. Their bodies are annihilated, their angelic fathers are imprisoned, their spiritual residue lingers as a kind of toxic afterimage. That mix of end and continuation ties into the flood imagery, even where the word flood itself is missing or fragmentary. The motifs that do survive are textbook flood judgment, surging water, foundations shaken, rooted things uprooted, a dream of a tablet being submerged and then emerging clean, trees and forests being cut down or swept away, a tower or structure collapsing. Underneath all of that is the theme of reversal. In Genesis and other flood myths, the flood is uncreation. The waters above and below, which were separated at the beginning of the world, crash back together. Boundaries dissolve. Dry land disappears. Everything returns, temporarily, to the primordial chaos. The Book of Giants leans into that theme but personalizes it. The giants have been living as walking boundary violations, part heavenly, part earthly, breaking the lines between species and domains. The judgment that comes is a reversal of that reversal. The world is going to be resorted, and in that resorting there is no place for them. Water in that symbolic universe isn't just liquid, it's the instrument of unmaking. It washes away the hybrid age. It buries the evidence. It carries off the noise and blood, and leaves behind a stripped down, smaller, more tightly bounded world. You can feel that pressure in the way the fragments talk about time. There's a sense of countdown, prophecies anchored to this generation, phrases like for a little while attached to their remaining dominion. When Enoch tells them you will have no peace, the point isn't only their final fate, it's their present condition. From the moment they hear the decree, they're living under a horizon that is rushing toward them. That awareness is exactly what shifts the story's tone. In a lot of ancient myths, the clash between gods and monsters plays out like a spectacle. You cheer for one side or the other. The outcome is exciting, not introspective. Here, because the text keeps circling back to what the giants know and feel, the whole thing becomes a prolonged tragedy. They are not innocent, but they are not ignorant anymore either. They dream, wake up terrified, seek interpretation, receive the worst possible answer, and then have to exist with that answer. Their physical strength doesn't help. Their size becomes irrelevant in the face of a decree that operates at the level of heaven's tablets, not battlefield tactics. That's why their last words in the fragments that preserve them aren't battle cries. They're laments, confessions, attempts to write letters to the Watchers, to negotiate, to ask whether any of their children might survive. There are hints, only hints, that some of them wonder about repentance, about changing their behaviour. But the response that comes back doesn't spend much time on moral reform. It announces an outcome. And this is where we have to flag the line between the text and our reconstruction. Because the manuscripts are broken, we don't see the giants actually drowning. We don't have a scene of them watching the ark float away. We infer that ending from adjacent material, from Genesis, from 1 Enoch, from later retellings. Scholars disagree on how tightly to connect those dots. Some argue the Book of Giants must have ended with a vivid description of the flood, and the giants' destruction mirroring the way other apocalyptic texts end in fireworks. Others think the real climax was not the physical event, but the legal pronouncement, the moment of decree after which the narrative could taper off, because the theological point had been made. We also don't all agree on how sharply the book distinguished between the fate of the Watchers and the fate of the giants, or on how strongly it tied the origin of demons to this story. Some of those connections come from later layers of the Enochic tradition, and may or may not have been present in the original composition. What is clear, across the fragments and across the disagreements, is the emotional shape of the ending. This isn't a story where the monsters are oblivious until the sword falls. It's a story where the condemned have time to think, to fear, to recognize themselves as both perpetrators and symptoms of a world that cannot go on as it is. The end, as the fragments portray it, is not just water on the horizon. It's the heavy knowledge that the future they are walking into has already been written, and that for beings like them, history stops there. To see how far this story travelled, we have to jump forward more than 1,000 years from Qumran and follow it into a very different world. 3rd century Persia. A man named Mani is trying to build a universal religion. Mani grew up in a region saturated with competing traditions: Zoroastrianism, varieties of Christianity, strands of Judaism, local Mesopotamian myths. His claim was bold. All the great revelations of the past were partial glimpses of a single, deeper truth. He saw himself as the final prophet in a chain that included the Buddha, Zoroaster, and Jesus. To make that work, he needed stories that could bridge cultures, tales that Jews, Christians, and Iranians might all recognize, but that he could plug into his own cosmic system. The giants were perfect for this. In the Manichaean literature that survives in Coptic, Middle Persian, and other languages, we find a work also called the Book of Giants. It's not just a quotation of the Qumran text, it's a remix, an adaptation that keeps the skeleton of the story but clothes it in a very different theology. This is one of the reasons the Book of Giants matters so much. It didn't just vanish with the Essenes. It was carried forward, translated, reinterpreted. and in the process it shows us which parts of the tale were flexible and which parts were too central to drop. So what happens when Mani's movement gets hold of the giants? First, the story gets pulled into a much bigger cosmology. In the Enochic world, the Watchers and giants explain why the pre-flood earth is violent, corrupt, and full of forbidden knowledge. The frame is basically Genesis plus. Israel's God, heaven, earth, angels, flood. In the Manichaean frame, everything is slotted into a radical dualism between light and darkness. Reality for Mani begins with two co-eternal realms. The realm of light is ruled by the Father of greatness. The realm of darkness is chaotic, aggressive, and hungry. The material world, our world, is the result of a catastrophic mixing of these two domains. Human beings carry particles of divine light trapped in bodies made from the stuff of darkness. When the Manichaean Book of Giants retells the story, the Watchers and their monstrous offspring are no longer just rebellious angels and hybrid warriors. They become actors in this cosmic light versus dark drama. The giants' bodies are framed as thick, coarse embodiments of darkness. Their souls, or at least some aspect of them, participate in the trapped light that Mani thought was scattered through all living things. Their violence and insatiable appetites fit neatly into his portrait of the dark realm's nature: ignorant, consuming, distorting. That shift in frame does a lot of work. The same basic storyline, heavenly beings transgress, hybrid offspring overrun the earth. Judgment comes, now serves as an allegory of what Mani thought was happening everywhere. All the time, light getting swallowed by matter, then painfully extracted again through judgment, ascetic practice, and cosmic processes. The second big change is moral emphasis. The Qumran fragments care about transgression, crossing boundaries God established, and about justice for a world ruined by that crossing. The tone is legal and prophetic. You broke the command. The decree has gone forth. Manichaean texts turn the volume up on moral dualism. It's not just that the Watchers did something wrong. It's that they aligned themselves with the dark principle against the light. Characters are framed much more sharply as instruments of one side or the other. You're not only guilty of a specific act, you are a manifestation of a cosmic faction. In some Manichaean fragments, the giant characters are still named Mahaweh, Ohaya, Hohaya, show up, but they are woven into long explanations about the archons of darkness, the princes of the world, and the fate of the light soul particles trapped within them. The narrative isn't just about whether the giants will survive the flood. It's about whether and how the divine light mixed into their being will be freed. That reframing changes the emotional colour. In the Qumran Book of Giants, the giants are tragic and doomed, but their tragedy is tied to a specific historical mythic crisis, that generation before the flood. In Mani's version, their fate becomes a type of what happens to all entities under the rule of darkness. Their destruction participates in a larger, ongoing purification of the cosmos. At the same time, the Manichaean Book of Giants preserves a surprising amount of older detail. The dream motifs are still there. We still find giants disturbed by visions of trees being uprooted, of tablets being washed, of structures collapsing. We still meet Mahaweh, the giant emissary, travelling to seek revelation. There are echoes of letters or messages to the higher beings, attempts to interpret ominous signs, talk of decrees. The overlap is too close to be coincidence. Different language, different theology, but the same core moves. Giants have dreams of doom. They send a representative to a wise heavenly figure. They receive a judgment that spells the end of their line. That suggests both the Qumran text and the Manichaean one are drawing on a shared earlier tradition, maybe an older Aramaic composition, maybe a bundle of stories, liturgies, and interpretations that circulated orally and in writing across Jewish and proto-Christian apocalyptic circles. Mani or his circle didn't just invent a book of giants from scratch. They took something that was already revered in certain communities translated it into their languages, and did what religious movements always do with inherited material. They bent it toward their own questions. This is an important point about how tradition works. A later community can be both preservers and reshapers at the same time. On one level, the Manichaeans are arch-conservatives. They bother to copy the giants' names. They keep the basic plot structure. They even retain specific narrative devices like the mission to the visionary sage. On another level, they're radical editors. Where the earlier story was about heaven and earth, angels and humans, they read it as a case study in light and darkness. Where the Qumran fragments emphasize covenantal law and divine decree, Manichaean texts emphasize metaphysical pollution and the extraction of light. If you put the two side by side, three differences in emphasis jump out. First, cosmology. The Qumran Book of Giants plugs into a Jewish apocalyptic picture: one God, a structured heaven, rebellious angels, a coming judgment in history. The Manichaean version places the same story inside a much grander, stranger architecture of two eternal principles, cycles of world creation and destruction, and souls migrating through bodies. Second, moral mapping. In Qumran, the giants are lawbreakers and products of lawbreaking. Their problem is disobedience and corruption. In Mani's hands, they are embodiments of the dark substance, mixed with light. Their problem is ontological as much as ethical, what they are made of, not just what they do. Third, character framing. In the earlier text, Enoch is a human taken into the divine council, a scribe of heavenly tablets. In Manichaean materials, the visionary figure who reveals mysteries is more easily aligned, directly or indirectly, with Mani's own prophetic role. The giants become foils illustrating why revelation is needed and what happens when beings stubbornly cling to the dark. Those differences are why we have to be careful. We can't just take a Manichaean passage about the Book of Giants, read it as is, and assume, this is exactly what the Essenes at Qumran believed. There's at least a 400 to 600 year gap, multiple language jumps, and a completely different religious system in between. When the Manichaean Book of Giants describes, say, the origin of demons or the mechanics of the giants' souls after death, some of that may echo older Jewish speculation, and some of it may be 100% Manichaean overlay. What we can do is look for the stable backbone, where the two traditions line up: giant names, dream imagery, the journey to seek interpretation, the sense of an irreversible decree. We have good reason to suspect we're seeing features of that earlier, shared narrative, where they diverge sharply: eternal light and darkness, elaborate metaphysical genealogies of archons, complex soul mechanics. We're probably seeing Mani's system talking through the story. That comparison tells us something about durability. Across centuries, languages, and theologies, certain themes refuse to die. The idea that immense, powerful beings can sense their own end before it arrives. The motif of dreams as a channel of judgment. The image of a messenger giant seeking out a higher, wiser figure to explain reality. The notion of a written decree somewhere in the heavens that seals their fate. Those motifs survive the trip from Second Temple Judaism into a Persian dualist religion because they speak to something bigger than any one system. They dramatize questions that keep recurring. What happens when power is misused? Can doom be foreseen but not escaped? Is there a script already written for the world? And if so, who gets to read it? The Manichaean Book of Giants doesn't give us a clean window back into Qumran, but it does give us a long echo, and by listening carefully to what stayed the same and what changed, we can trace the outline of a story that was too potent to be left behind, even when everything around it, empires, sects, scriptures, kept shifting. So if the Book of Giants could travel that far, show up in a movement as distant from Qumran as Manichaeism, why doesn't it show up in the Bibles most people know today? This is where words like banned, forbidden, and suppressed start getting thrown around. But we need to slow down and ask what those words really mean. When people say a text was banned from the Bible, they're usually bundling together several different things. Sometimes they mean non-canonical. It never made it into the official list of books a given community treats as scripture. Sometimes they mean disputed. It was loved and quoted by some teachers, side-eyed or rejected by others. And sometimes they mean marginalized. It stopped being copied, stopped being read in public worship, and slowly slid to the edges of religious memory. All three of those happened in different ways to Enochic literature. One, Enoch, Jubilees, and works like the Book of Giants that grew up in the same orbit. But banned can make it sound like there was one central board of censors somewhere in late antiquity, stamping denied on anything with giants and watchers. History is messier than that. First, the obvious but often forgotten point. There is no single universal biblical canon. Jewish communities, Eastern Orthodox churches, Roman Catholics, Copts, Ethiopians, various Protestant traditions, they do not all agree on where the borders of Scripture lie. They never have. Second Temple Judaism itself didn't have a fixed, universally accepted list. It had a library, multiple libraries actually, of revered writings. Torah was central. The prophets had enormous weight. The Psalms and some other writings came to be seen as authoritative. But around the edges there was a whole halo of texts that some groups treated almost like scripture, and others treated as learned commentary or edifying story. The Qumran community clearly ranked Enochic books very highly. They copied them obsessively. They wrote their own interpretations of them. They stitched Enoch's language into their own self-understanding. Elsewhere in mainstream rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the temple, those same Enoch traditions cooled. The rabbinic canon that eventually crystallized, the Tanakh, is closer to what Christians call the Hebrew Bible. No one Enoch. No Jubilees, no Book of Giants. The flood story is there. The line about sons of God and Nephilim is there. But all the narrative expansion around it is left off stage. In Christianity, something different happens. Early Christian writers, especially in the first few centuries, quote one Enoch a lot. The New Testament letter of Jude actually cites one Enoch directly. Church fathers like Tertullian defend it. Others treat it as useful but not quite scripture. Still others avoid it. Over time, in the Greek and Latin-speaking churches that would become Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic, one Enoch drifts out of the canon column and into the interesting but not binding column. It keeps circulating in some circles as a source of angelology and apocalyptic imagination. But it's not part of the core scriptural package. In the Ethiopian church, though, the story goes a different way. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserves one Enoch in its biblical canon to this day. For them, Enoch's world is not an apocryphal curiosity. It is scripture, so even the question, why was Enoch left out of the Bible, has to be qualified. Which Bible? In which community? At what point in time? Against that background, the fate of the Book of Giants becomes easier to see. It belongs to a cluster of texts that were enormously influential in some Second Temple circles, echo loudly in early Christianity, and then gradually lose ground in the mainstream Jewish and Christian canons that most later believers inherited. Why? Part of the answer is practical. Canonical status wasn't just a matter of is this cool. Communities asked questions like, does this text come from a recognized prophetic or apostolic figure? Does it fit what we already confess about God and the world? Does it help structure our worship and our law? Is it widely read and agreed on in the communities we trust? On those fronts, the Book of Giants had problems. Its authorship is opaque. It lives in Enoch's universe, but it's not itself presented as a full Enochic revelation the way one Enoch is. It's more like a spin-off episode centered on the giant's perspective. In a world where pseudonymous writing was common but still debated, a side story narrated through the mouths of condemned hybrids was not an obvious candidate for "this is the voice of Scripture." Its theology is also intense. The Watcher's sin, the birth of monstrous offspring, the teaching of forbidden arts, the idea that primordial violence is tied to angelic sex and cosmic law-breaking. That's a lot to handle. Some Jewish interpreters, after the 1st century, leaned toward more restrained readings of Genesis 6, downplaying the angelic rebellion and reading sons of God as human rulers instead. A full-blown Watchers and Giants saga cut sharply against that trend. And liturgy matters. Canon isn't just about what you're allowed to believe. It's about what you recite in synagogue or church, what you chant, what you put on the lectern week after week. Legal texts, historical narratives, prophetic oracles, psalms, wisdom sayings, those are easy to plug into communal ritual and instruction. A fragmented apocalypse told from the viewpoint of doomed giants, filled with bizarre dreams and celestial decrees, is much harder to integrate into a regular cycle of readings for children, catechumens, or ordinary worshippers. Community boundaries played a role too. Books that were beloved by groups later deemed heretical or suspect tended to become suspicious by association. Enochic literature was popular at Qumran. Later, rabbis often wanted to distinguish themselves sharply from sectarian groups like the Essenes. Manichaeans and other fringe or rival movements picked up the Book of Giants. Church leaders fighting those movements were not eager to sanctify the texts their opponents wielded. If a book is central to the theology of people you're arguing against, you're less likely to promote it as scripture in your own community. But that doesn't mean there was a secret meeting where bishops or rabbis sat down and said, "We must suppress the Book of Giants so no one will ever read it again." The evidence we actually have points to slower, more distributed processes. Scribes have limited time and materials. They copy the texts their communities care about most. Over generations, that creates winners and losers in the manuscript race. Teachers quote the books that best support the arguments they want to make. Those quotations get embedded in sermons, commentaries, and liturgies. That raises the profile of some works and lets others fade. Councils and local synods sometimes draw up lists of books approved for use in church readings. Those lists harden over time into canons, texts that never had much public liturgical use in the first place, rarely make the cut. In that environment, the Book of Giants never had the same structural advantages as, say, Genesis or Isaiah. It probably never had the same breadth of usage as one Enoch or Jubilees. It was always more niche, more tied to specific apocalyptic circles and their obsessions. And yet, forbidden versions of its story kept spreading anyway. You can watch them leak out sideways. Jewish and Christian interpreters retell the flood narrative and quietly smuggle in details that are not in Genesis, but sound a lot like Enoch and the Book of Giants. Angels marrying human women, giant offspring, secret teachings, corruption of the earth. Later Jewish midrash, Christian homilies, and popular legends talk about Nephilim, fallen angels, and pre-flood violence in ways that assume a backstory. That backstory looks suspiciously Enochic. By the Middle Ages, even in traditions where one Enoch and the Book of Giants were long gone as physical books, their DNA is still in the bloodstream. You see it in demonology, in angel hierarchies, in speculation about where evil comes from, in stray comments about giants surviving the flood or about the Watchers who fell. That's the paradox. A work can be non-canonical, even largely lost, and still shape imagination through paraphrase, allusion and retelling. The Book of Giants seems to have worked that way. It didn't win the canon lottery in most communities. But its themes and narrative moves got recycled, reframed, and smuggled into other stories that did. So was it banned, in the strict sense of a coordinated, empire-wide censorship program? There's no solid evidence for that. in the softer sense that its chances of canonization were undercut by questions of authorship, theological eaginess, sectarian associations, and limited liturgical usefulness. Yes, you can say it was effectively kept outside the official borders of Scripture in most traditions. And yet, like the giants themselves staring at their doomed world and trying to send messages upward, the story refused to be entirely silenced. It just found other channels. It seeped into midrash, into apocryphal tales, into Manichaean cosmology, into the background assumptions of preachers and poets. It lived on at the edge of the library, in the margins and footnotes, in the spaces where curiosity about the Nephilim outlasted formal decisions about which books belonged on the altar. Which brings us to the last question. If this work mostly survived by whisper and echo, what does its testimony actually give us? What might it be trying to say from beyond the walls of the canon about power, judgment, and the end of giants? What happens if you stop treating the Book of Giants as a collection of weird fragments about ancient monsters and start asking what kind of truth it's trying to tell? There are a few different lenses you can use, and they're not mutually exclusive. One way is to read it as a mythic warning. In that frame, the giants are what happens when every boundary gets crossed at once. Heaven and earth, angel and human, knowledge and responsibility, desire and restraint. The Watchers ignore the line between divine and mortal. They take human wives. They hand out knowledge that belongs in the heavenly realm. The result isn't just big people. It's disproportion, appetite without limit, violence without ceiling. The world fills up with beings that consume everything around them and cannot stop. Seen that way, the Book of Giants isn't really about whether there were 10-story tall people stomping around before the flood. It's about what it looks like when a civilization's power outgrows its wisdom and its empathy. When your capacity to extract, to fight, to control, runs way ahead of your capacity to care what any of that does to the world. Another way is to read it as a polemic against illicit knowledge. Notice what the Watchers teach: metalworking for weapons and ornament, cosmetics and seduction, sorcery and astrology, root-cutting and incantations. These are not neutral science. They're arts of control. Control of nature, control of other people, control of fate. The Book of Giants, like 1 Enoch, takes those things very seriously. It doesn't say, oh, technology is just a tool, it's how you use it. It says some knowledge is fundamentally out of bounds when it's detached from obedience, limits, and reverence. When it's handed to beings, human or hybrid, who are still toddlers morally. The giants' dreams in this reading are what happens when the bill for that experiment finally comes due. They see trees uprooted, tablets washed away, the earth overturned. They realize the very structures that made their way of life possible are about to be dismantled. Not because God is having a bad day, but because the system they've built cannot coexist with a livable world. Then there's the violence. The Book of Giants is obsessed with it. The giants devour humans. They drink blood. They ravage the earth. Their very bodies are made of violation. If you step back, that sounds less like the behavior of individuals and more like the footprint of systems, empires, armies, extractive economies that treat everything living as fuel. That leads to a third lens, symbolism. Ancient writers were perfectly capable of using monstrous figures to talk about very human realities. In later biblical texts, beasts in apocalyptic visions clearly stand for empires. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. Huge hybrid animals rising from the sea made of claws and horns and iron teeth are symbolic ways of saying, this political machine eats nations. You can read the giants in a similar way. They might represent warrior elites whose wealth and status come from organized violence. They might stand for superpowers whose armies trample smaller peoples and strip the land. They might, at an even more abstract level, embody cosmic disorder. The chaos that breaks loose whenever created limits are treated as optional. In that symbolic frame, their size is a metaphor for scale. They are too big, too strong, too hungry. They monopolize resources and crush what's around them just by existing the way they do. And when they begin to dream of their own destruction, you could hear that as a culture dimly sensing that the way it's living cannot last. That there is no scenario where their dominance continues and the world survives. Whichever lens you use, giving the monsters a voice changes the flood story. In Genesis, the world is wicked. God sees that every inclination of the human heart is only evil continually. The flood is a top-down response. We don't hear from the people swept away. We don't know what they thought or feared or justified to themselves. In the Book of Giants we do. We step inside the camp of the condemned and listen to them panic. We watch them receive messages. We see them argue. We hear their half-formed repentance, their bargaining, their confusion. They are not sympathized with exactly. The text never suggests they're innocent victims, but it does let them speak. It lets them feel dread. It lets them ask for interpretation. It even lets some of them send appeals through Enoch, as if there might still be another outcome. That narrative choice does two things. First, it complicates the moral picture. Judgment is still portrayed as necessary, but it's not cartoonishly simple. The giants are aware enough to know they're in the wrong, but not wise enough, or humble enough, or early enough to change course in time. Second, it turns the story into a mirror. It's harder to keep the giants as pure others when you hear them dream of loss, argue over what to do, and cling to their habits even as the sky darkens. They start to look uncomfortably familiar. The giants' world is also drenched in apocalyptic concerns that go far beyond one flood, boundaries. What is allowed to mix, and what must stay apart? Justice. How far can corruption go before the structure of creation itself starts to break under the strain? Cost. Who pays when power is abused? Who pays when knowledge is used to dominate rather than serve? The Book of Giants frames all of that in cosmic language. Angels, heavenly tablets, decrees from on high, but the anxieties are very human. They're the same questions apocalyptic literature keeps circling. How long can injustice go on? Who is really in charge? Will there be a reckoning? And if so, will anyone be left? That's part of why, even though most people have never read the fragments themselves, the Nephilim have become a magnet for modern fascination. Browse certain corners of the internet, and the giants are everywhere, buried skeleton photoshopped to impossible sizes, conspiracy theories about hidden bones under the Smithsonian, claims that world governments are suppressing proof of pre-flood super races. Those fascinations say as much about us as they do about any ancient text. They tap into a sense that official stories are incomplete, that there's a hidden layer of history in which the powerful are stranger and more dangerous than we've been told. But when you go back to the actual fragments, a lot of the pop culture add-ons fall away. The Book of Giants doesn't give us detailed giant biology. It doesn't provide secret maps of pre-flood cities. It doesn't describe advanced technology or UFOs. It gives us a small set of hybrid beings having terrifying dreams, trying to understand them, and failing to avert a disaster they helped create. In other words, it's not a cryptid field guide, it's an ethical drama. The giants are interesting, not because of how tall they were, but because of what they reveal about the temptation to live, as if there are no limits and no consequences, and about what it feels like when that illusion breaks. So what do you do with a text like that? You could leave it where history mostly left it, on the margins, a curiosity for specialists and enthusiasts. You could mine it for lore, bolt its fragments onto modern mythologies about hidden bloodlines and secret elites, and treat it as esoteric data. Or you could let it ask you a harder question. If this is a story in which the narrators, the giants whose perspective we share, the hybrid rulers whose dreams we read, end up condemned by the very logic of their own lives, what does that mean for us? What does it mean to recognize yourself, even a little, in the panic of beings who realize too late that the world they built is not sustainable? And if the Book of Giants is, in its own fractured way, a testimony from the side of the doomed, then, as readers thousands of years later, standing outside their world but living with our own versions of their choices, what responsibility do we have to that testimony? That's where we'll end, with the question the giants can't answer for us. When you inherit a story that lets the destroyers of their own age speak, and shows you how their power, their knowledge, and their appetites walked them to the edge of extinction, what do you do with it? If you've made it this far, you've walked with a very strange set of voices. So before we close, let's gather what we actually have and what we don't. At the most basic level, the Book of Giants is fragments. Not a neat narrative, not a secret, fully preserved pre-flood chronicle. Scraps, bits of Aramaic from Qumran caves, broken lines where names trail off. Scenes you have to reconstruct from context and parallel texts. Later Manichaean versions that clearly remember the same story, but remix it through a very different religious lens. Everything we've talked about sits on top of that reality. We know there are giants with names, personalities, and fears. We know some of them dream about trees, tablets, towers, and destruction. We know they send messengers. We know Enoch appears as an interpreter and mediator. We know the verdict they get back is not the one they want. But the shape of the story between those points is partly solid, partly smoke. Where the text is clear, we can say it says this. Where it's broken or ambiguous, we're dealing in possibilities, plausible reconstructions, educated guesses, comparative readings with 1 Enoch, Genesis, and later retellings. Holding that tension is one of the main takeaways. This is not a book you can use as a proof text for your favourite theory about ancient super soldiers or secret technologies. It won't cooperate. It just doesn't give you that level of detail. What it does give you is something subtler and, in some ways, more unsettling. It gives you the dreams of doomed rulers. Those dream sequences are the beating heart of the Book of Giants. Towering trees cut down, tablets submerged and wiped clean, a giant statue collapsed and broken, the earth itself shaken, reordered, scoured. You don't need to accept the literal existence of Nephilim to feel what those images are doing. They are premonitions of a world where the structures that guarantee your dominance don't exist anymore. A world in which your size, your violence, your network of power suddenly don't matter. The fact that these are the giant's own dreams is important. No prophet shows up first with a speech about judgment. The unease starts inside their own minds. Something in their subconscious is already registering the mismatch between how they live and what the world can bear. Then Enoch enters. He's not just a mystical cameo. In this tradition, he's the bridge figure, a human taken up, granted access to heavenly tablets, used as a messenger between realms. The giants send to him because they want what we all want in a crisis: interpretation and options. What does this mean? Is there a way out? Is there a loophole? Can you talk to God for us? The Book of Giants lets us watch that process fail. Enoch comes back with a message that is almost unbearably simple. The damage is too deep. The decree stands, judgment is coming. There will be no second world built on the same foundations as the first. At that point, the text doesn't give us a satisfying repentance arc. We see grief, bargaining, fear. We see some of the giants trying to rally each other to deny or reinterpret what they've heard. We do not see them dismantle the system that made them what they are. That brings us to the last key element: impending judgment. In Genesis, judgment is a cosmic reset, but the logic is compressed. In the Book of Giants, that logic is stretched out. We feel the time lag between cause and effect. Generations of violence and exploitation, then dreams, then consultation, then the heavenly verdict. Then a waiting period where nothing and everything has changed. The flood hasn't hit yet. The sun still rises. The giants still eat, trade, fight, boast. That delay is where the story stings, because that's where a lot of human history sits, after the warnings, before the wave. So what can we responsibly do with all of this? Historically, we can say a few things with confidence. We can say that Second Temple Jews were wrestling hard with the questions of evil, injustice, and cosmic order, and that the Book of Giants is one experiment in answering those questions. We can say that for at least some communities, giving the Nephilim a voice was a way to deepen the flood story, to think about guilt, regret, and inevitability from the inside. We can say that later groups like the Manichaeans found this material powerful enough to preserve, expand, and reinterpret centuries after it dropped out of mainstream Jewish and Christian canons. Beyond that, we move from solid ground into gradients of speculation. Are the giants purely symbolic, partly historical memory of real elites, echoes of even older Mesopotamian myths reframed through a monotheistic lens? Different readers will weight those possibilities differently. What we can't honestly do is treat this as a lost Bible chapter that solves every mystery or confirms every modern conspiracy. The canon choices of ancient communities, what got included, what stayed out, were shaped by theology, liturgy, politics, and sheer accident of manuscript survival. The Book of Giants sat near the edges of that process, and eventually slipped over the side. You can see that as a sinister ban, or you can see it as the normal churn of a culture deciding which voices to centre. Either way, the text survives just enough to still ask questions, and the sharpest of those questions circles back to agency, blame, and consequences. When you look at the giants, the Watchers, and the flood through this lens, where does responsibility land? On the heavenly beings who crossed a line and handed out dangerous knowledge, on the hybrid elites who built a world on consumption and war, on the broader human society that benefited from that system and went along with it, or on a divine order that allowed any of this to unfold in the first place? Ancient writers gave different emphases. The fragments don't settle it for us, but they push us toward a harder reflection. In your own world, which part are you playing? Are you more like the Watchers passing along tools and information without caring what they're used for? More like the giants living inside systems that chew through people and land, feeling the dread but choosing to ride it out? More like the bystanders hoping the decrees of heaven or history or nature won't land too hard on your doorstep? If a voice like Enoch stood in front of you and said, "The way this is set up cannot last," what, if anything, would you actually change? That's not a question the Book of Giants can answer. It only dramatizes the moment when there are no changes left to make. The rest is on us, so I'd love to hear how you're reading this text. Do you see the giants mostly as symbols, as half-remembered history, as theology about fallen angels, or as something else entirely? And what other marginal or banned adjacent texts would you like to see unpacked next? More from 1 Enoch, Jubilees, the Apocalypse of Abraham, the Gospel of Thomas, something from the Nag Hammadi Library? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and while you're there, tell me where you're listening from, and if you want, what time it is where you are right now. One of the strange joys of talking about ancient apocalypses on the internet is realizing this little community is spread across time zones and continents, all tuning in to the same very old questions. If this deep dive into the Book of Giants helped you see the Nephilim in a new way, or maybe just made you a little more suspicious of 10-story-tall skeleton memes, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Your comments, questions, and shares are what keep this kind of long-form exploration possible. The fragments we have from the giants are thin, but what they're trying to talk about, power, limits, justice, and what happens when you burn through all three, is not going anywhere. How we choose to answer those questions now is the part of the story that isn't written yet.